Okay, let's dive in. When you think about the really big decisions a company makes, like where do you build that massive new factory? Where do you sink billions of dollars?
Yeah, it's huge.
It's not just about, labor costs or where the materials are. So much of it comes down to trust. Can you actually rely on the promises?
Especially promises from a government, right? When they roll out the red carpet, offer
Yeah.
incentives, that's supposed to be solid ground.
Exactly. Because those promises, they're often the bedrock for making that huge investment decision in the first place. But what happens if that bedrock starts to feel a bit shaky years later?
Well, that's pretty much the core question in a big legal fight happening right now in India. We're zeroing in on West Bengal today.
Right. It involves Dalmia Bharat, a massive cement company.
A giant, yeah. And they're squaring off against the state government there. They're basically saying the government made commitments that brought them to West Bengal, and now those aren't being honored.
So Dalmia's position is, hey, you offered us these really significant financial incentives to build our plant here. We did our part, we built it, and now where's the money?
Exactly. And it's a situation that raises some pretty serious questions, not just for Dalmia or the Bengal government, but really for anyone interested in how governments attract businesses and, crucially, whether their word holds up over time.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack this. We'll use the information we've got to understand the background, what the fight is actually about, the legal arguments flying around.
And maybe most importantly, why this whole thing matters beyond the courtroom.
Hmm.
What are the ripple effects for investment, for the economy, maybe even just for the basic idea of reliability when it comes to government policy?
Okay, let's set the scene then. We need to rewind a bit.
Yeah.
West Bengal. It has a significant industrial past, but like a lot of places, it's been working hard to, bring in new growth, attract fresh industry.
Absolutely. They've been actively trying to revitalize things. And a key part of that strategy was policy. Back in 2013, the West Bengal government launched something called the West Bengal Incentive Scheme.
Right, I remember that.
Yeah, it was basically a big signal to the market saying, look, come invest here. We'll make it worth your while with some real financial benefits. It was designed to overcome hesitation and make the state look like a good bet for capital.
And it seems like some big names were paying attention. Dalmia Bharat, definitely a major force in India's cement sector. They looked at this 2013 scheme.
They did. And based on those incentives being offered, in 2016, they decided to commit. We're not talking small change here. This was a huge investment, crores and crores, to set up a major cement plant in West Bengal.
So they put their money where their mouth was based on that scheme.
Absolutely. They went through the whole process, building the facility, getting the machinery, the infrastructure, a massive real-world commitment. And, that meant creating local jobs, boosting suppliers, contributing exactly the kind of economic activity the scheme was aiming for. They really did hold up their end.
Okay, but now fast forward. It's 2025, and Dalmia Bharat is saying, hang on, those incentives we were promised,
Yeah.
they never actually showed up.
And this is where it gets messy. And you can imagine, pretty frustrating for Dalmia. They're claiming that the specific financial perks laid out in that 2013 scheme, the perks that were a big reason they invested so much, just haven't been delivered.
What kind of perks are we talking about specifically?
Well, the main things in dispute seem to be pretty crucial for a big industrial operation, like a cement plant. Things like GST reimbursements.
Okay, getting back some of the goods and services tax they paid, that's significant for a large company.
Huge. And also power subsidies. Cement making uses an incredible amount of energy, so cheaper power is a really big deal for their bottom line.
Makes sense.
And then there were capital subsidies, too. Basically direct financial help to offset some of those enormous initial costs of just building the plant itself.
Yeah, these aren't just nice to haves. These sound like things that would heavily influence whether a project like this is even viable financially.
Precisely. These are potentially margin-defining incentives. They would have been factored right into the return on investment calculations for a project costing crores.
And Dalmia is saying that despite them setting up shop, running the plant, the state's Industrial Promotion and Development Department just hasn't paid out these funds.
That's their claim. Failed to disperse the money.
What reasons are being given? Or what reasons does Dalmia say they've been given?
Well, according to Dalmia's filings, the reasons sound frustratingly vague. Things like policy changes or maybe budget constraints.
Which, if you're the company that invested based on a 2013 scheme, built your plant in 2016, hearing about policy changes years later probably doesn't sit well.
Not at all. Especially after you've already sunk all that capital. From their perspective, it feels like the rules changed after the game started. They likely see these not as solid legal reasons, but more like excuses.
Which pushed them towards taking this out of departmental meetings and into a much more public, formal arena.
It did. Things clearly weren't getting resolved. So on March 25th, 2025, Dalmia Bharat took the major step of filing a petition directly in the Calcutta High Court.
And their basic argument to the court is,
It really boils down to an accusation of a fundamental breach of trust. They're essentially saying, look, you induced us, you encouraged us to make this massive, irreversible investment with specific promises. By not keeping those promises, you're unfairly putting our entire investment at risk.
so it's an argument about the government's word needing to mean something legally, especially when it's part of an official policy designed to get companies to invest.
Exactly. That's the core of it.
Okay, so this legal fight is playing out in the Calcutta High Court.
Yep. A very historic court, handles a lot of complex cases, including ones involving government actions in industry. And this case is before a division bench, which usually signals it's seen as quite significant.
Now, Dalmia's legal strategy seems to rely heavily on this concept, promissory estoppel.
It sounds complicated, but the idea behind it is actually quite straightforward, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. Basically, think of it like this. Someone makes you a clear promise. Because of that promise, you go and do something significant, maybe spend a lot of money, change your position, something you wouldn't have done otherwise.
Right.
Promissory estoppel is the legal idea that stops the person who made the promise from just backing out, especially if you'd be worse off because you relied on what they said.
So Dalmia is effectively arguing your promise of incentives was clear. We relied on it, spent crores building this plant. You're now legally estopped, blocked from breaking that promise because we acted based on it. That's the essence of it. They're saying the government created a legitimate expectation, they acted on that expectation with a massive investment, and it would be unfair, inequitable to let the government just walk away now.
And they probably have some legal precedent to back this up.
They likely do. There was, for instance, a Delhi High Court ruling back in 2022 that touched on similar principles.
What did that ruling say?
Well, it reinforced the idea that government bodies generally are expected to honor the commitments they make, especially when private parties have relied on those commitments and acted upon them. Now, it's not absolute. There can be exceptions, like if there's a really powerful public interest reason to change course.
But the general rule is you can't just change your mind after someone's acted on your promise.
That's the general thrust, yes. The government isn't just like any other party that can easily break a deal after inducing someone else to invest based on it.
Okay, that sounds like a strong argument for Dalmia. But the West Bengal government must have a defense strategy, right? What might they argue in court?
Oh, absolutely, they'll have a defense. They'll likely try to argue that promissory estoppel doesn't or shouldn't apply here. They might claim those policy changes or budget constraints they mention are actually legitimate, compelling reasons that excuse them legally from the original 2013 terms.
So they could argue that circumstances have drastically changed. The economic situation in 2025 is just completely different from 2013 or 2016, making the original promises impossible or unwise to keep now.
That's very likely a key part of their argument. They might say, unforeseen economic pressures, other urgent budget needs, maybe shifting development priorities mean they just don't have the funds, or that fulfilling the old promises isn't aligned with current state goals.
Could they also maybe pick apart the original agreement? Look for loopholes?
Possibly. They might scrutinize the exact wording of the 2013 scheme, looking for clauses that gave the state some flexibility or discretion. Or they could try to argue Dalmia didn't meet every single condition perfectly, although the main complaint seems to be about non-payment, not Dalmia failing to comply.
It still feels like a tough argument to make. Sorry, times changed after a company has already built a huge plant based on your earlier promise.
It's definitely a challenging position, legally and frankly ethically. That's precisely why the doctrine of promissory estoppel exists, to prevent that kind of situation where one party benefits from reliance and then tries to back out. The court's job will be to weigh the government's reasons very carefully against this fundamental principle of fairness and reliance.
Okay, so obviously this case is massively important for Dalmia Bharat and the West Bengal government. Huge amounts of money are involved. But let's zoom out. Why should someone listening to us right now care about this particular dispute?
Right, this is where we move beyond just the specifics of cement and subsidies. This case is kind of a litmus test, isn't it? It's about the fundamental trust between governments and the businesses they're trying to attract, not just in West Bengal, but potentially across India and even globally.
Because the implications are pretty wide. If a state can announce an official incentive plan, make promises, watch a company invest billions relying on those promises, and then later just say, sorry, plans changed, budget's tight, well, what kind of message does that send out?
It sends a really chilling message, doesn't it? If the reliability of these government commitments is thrown into doubt, businesses, especially those considering large long-term investments, are going to get very, very nervous.
Because predictability is key for them.
Absolutely key. They do intense planning, financial modeling. If a promised incentive, which is part of that model, can just vanish, the whole project's viability could be undermined. Why would you risk sinking massive capital somewhere if you can't be sure the government partner will hold up their end of the bargain?
And that kind of nervousness, that hesitation, it directly impacts economic growth, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If businesses lack confidence in government promises, it can deter investment both from within the country and from abroad. Fewer investments mean fewer new factories, fewer jobs, less economic activity overall.
Which, for a state like West Bengal that's been actively working to attract industry and maybe overcome some past industrial challenges, this could potentially make that job harder, right? It could create uncertainty.
It certainly could fuel investor concerns about policy stability and the long-term reliability of commitments made by the state. It adds another layer of risk assessment for potential investors looking at the region.
And there's another angle too, the taxpayer.
Yes, really important point. Ultimately, these incentive schemes are funded by public money. So the public has a real stake in making sure these schemes actually work, that they're managed transparently and fairly.
And working means not just attracting the investment, but also following through on the promises made to secure it.
Exactly. If the government makes promises, gets the investment, but then doesn't pay, it calls into question the effectiveness of the whole policy. Did it really achieve its goal if the commitment wasn't honored? And it raises broader questions about how public funds and policy tools are being managed.
So this court case really throws a spotlight on the government's relationship not just with business, but also with its own policies and potentially its use of public resources.
It touches on legal principles, economic confidence, public accountability. It's all interconnected.
So looking down the road, what's the likely path for this case in the Calcutta High Court?
Well, the court has a lot to sift through. They'll need to examine the 2013 scheme in detail, look at all the communication between the government and Dalmia, consider the scale of Dalmia's investment made because of those promises.
And weigh that against the government's reasons for not paying.
Precisely. They need to weigh the government's justifications, the policy changes, budget issues against that core legal principle of promissory estoppel.
And the fundamental question they have to answer is,
It really boils down to, was the government's refusal to pay the promised incentives an unlawful breach of a commitment that Dalmia reasonably relied upon? Or, alternatively, were the government's reasons valid and legally sufficient to justify breaking from the original terms, maybe fitting into some kind of exception to the estoppel rule?
and given the amount of documentation, the legal arguments, and let's face it, the workload in a major courts, this probably won't be a quick decision.
Almost certainly not. It's complex, with significant implications. Both sides will present detailed cases, and the court will need time to deliberate carefully.
So, wrapping up our deep dive today, this Dalmia Bharat versus West Bengal case really stands out. It's a critical test happening right now of whether a government's promise specifically made to attract job-creating, economy-boosting investment is treated as a firm, binding commitment.
Or if it's more like a conditional offer, something that can be withdrawn if circumstances change down the line.
And the outcome, whichever way it goes, is likely to send ripples well beyond this specific dispute.
Definitely. It's about that intangible but absolutely vital foundation of trust. The trust businesses need to feel confident putting huge amounts of capital on the line, not just in West Bengal, but it could influence perceptions of policy risk elsewhere too.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, just how much our whole economic system built on contracts, agreements, government policies fundamentally relies on the expectation that promises will generally be kept. From something small like a personal agreement all the way up to these massive projects depending on government assurances. What happens? What are the real costs? When that trust starts to fray, it's certainly a case worth watching.